Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another Q&A video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. I have 6 pages of questions from all the fine folks on the Forgotten Weapons Patreon. And, well, let's just dive right in to some of today's questions. So we'll start with Ryan, who says, what are your thoughts on Aimpoint now offering a multi-reticle red dot in the form of the Duty RDS MR? Several years ago, you asked an Aimpoint rep at the SHOT Show a question about them offering different reticle options, and they said they never would in a considerable number of words. Yes, indeed they did. I think what has actually happened is essentially the market has bullied Aimpoint into offering a multi-reticle option. I'm pretty sure that Aimpoint still doesn't think it's actually beneficial. I think they're quite solidly behind the science and experience of just having a plain single red dot, but so many of their competitors are offering a variety. Usually it's the 65 MOA EOTech style circle with or without the dot in the middle. It's honestly, it looks like a shortcoming in their red dots, and I think they're offering it simply because it's what the customer base is demanding, even though I'm pretty sure Aimpoint doesn't think it's actually useful to people. But just start looking a little lagging behind the industry if you don't add some elements like that. So I understand Aimpoint. I actually just did a bunch of filming at Aimpoint, and I've got some videos coming on a bunch of their early optics, their vintage optics, as well as some really cool experimental programs they did that never came to fruition. I'm a big fan of Aimpoint, but even I look at that and I go, it seems like, everyone else is offering features that you don't have. So I think they just caved to that demand. Next up is Dave, who said, after decades of shooting, I recently had my blood checked for lead levels. Have you considered having this test performed? I have, actually. I got my blood checked about a year ago. My blood lead level was slightly elevated. It was something like 5, and I don't remember the exact scale, but it's 5 on a scale of where like 25 is when they start actually being seriously concerned. I don't like it being a bit elevated. Frankly, the ideal level of lead in your blood is 0. Your body does shed it over time, but it is definitely very possible, especially if you do a lot of shooting in indoor ranges with poor ventilation systems, you can have surprisingly, potentially dangerously high lead levels if you do a lot of that. It's interesting. One of the driving factors with low back pressure, aka flow-through suppressors, was that there were some military special ops sort of guys who were doing a ton of training with suppressors in enclosed shoot house type environments who were getting some serious toxicity issues from breathing in the gas from that shooting, and that can affect all of us. So personally, I do virtually all of my shooting at outdoor ranges. I try to take care to only handle targets with gloves and have some basic hygiene precautions, washing my hands very carefully, extensively after I've been out shooting. I do have slightly elevated lead levels. It doesn't seem to be that relevant of an issue. After I got the blood test back, it took me like 6 months to get a telehealth appointment with a toxicity specialist who spent about an hour trying to figure out where my blood levels might have come from, which to me was pretty obviously is probably the shooting. And then the conclusion was, well, we'll just watch it for a year and see what happens. So the doctor doesn't seem particularly concerned. I'd love to get it down. I'm going to be more careful with my target and lead handling protocols, but yes, if you are a shooter, especially if you do a lot of shooting at an indoor range, I would strongly recommend getting your blood lead levels checked next time you're at the doctor. It is a very easy test to have added to just routine blood work, and you should do it. It's good to know. All right, winter, by the way, has finally hit here in even southern Arizona, which means 2 things. It means I'm putting on the cool Nordic sweater, and it also means we're going to break out some nice baking spice warm and toasty fireplace whiskey, specifically Kiro malt. I actually visited Kiro like 5 years ago now, 4 years ago now, about 4 years ago now. They are located 400 kilometers, that's like 250 miles north of Helsinki in Iso-Kiro, Finland, and they make a fantastic rye whiskey, 100% rye, single malt, made in a pair of actually Scottish purchased, I'll just leave that out right there, pot stills. A lot of Canadians have what they call rye whiskey, which actually can have almost no rye in it. This is like Scottish single malt style of rye whiskey. It's softer than most. Nice, rounded, like this is the taste of a warm fireplace, and it's fantastic. And to be fully transparent with you, Kiro has offered to help sponsor Q&A videos. So if you're interested in trying some of this yourself or some of their gins, they also have a couple of really good gins, including an aged dark gin, head over to their website, kirodistillery.com, or there are a couple different websites depending on what country you're in. I'll link in the description text below. And if you use the code ForgottenRye10, you will get 10% off of a fantastic bottle of Finnish rye whiskey or gin. Anyway, with my blatant shilling, which I am happy to do because I really like this brand, let's move on to our next question, which comes from Patrick. Patrick says, I know you have a love for scuba diving as well as history and firearms. Do you have any short or long-term travel plans allowing you to combine these interests? Yes, I do, actually. So if you're not aware, and you probably aren't because I haven't really publicized it, I actually have a second channel that I started called Deep Dive with Ian on scuba diving. I call it Scuba for Curious People, covering all sorts of different areas of scuba diving, from history to technology to biology and wildlife and all sorts of fun stuff. I've done a little bit of historical diving. We have a cool video over there on diving some Roman ruins. I actually have some travel plans coming up in about a year to go diving on at Truck Lagoon, which is the best scuba accessible repository of World War II wrecks. That's going to be fantastic, and that will actually be open probably to some of you guys. So I'll have more about that in a little while once we get those plans finalized, but that is definitely a thing that's coming up. And then, of course, I have hypothetical plans that I would love to do that I just haven't had the opportunity to, that are not so much history but firearms related with scuba, and that is trying out one of the handful of actual issued underwater guns underwater. The Russians have their APS rifle. The Germans, HK, made their P11 underwater pistol, and I would love to actually do some video shooting one of those, or ideally both of those, underwater. But they're really inaccessible guns. They're hard to get. HK is super paranoid about letting you know anything about the P11, even though they published it in their own book. So I don't know when that'll happen. Filming live fire underwater is a whole bunch of extra levels of complication, but someday, hopefully, that will happen. Our next question is from Gun Dr. Bob. It says, the early 5.56 round that we had in Vietnam was sent down a 1 in 12 barrel, had a most devastating terminal effect due to its borderline instability. Wounds were a lot more serious than typical 30 cal rounds from an M16 or an AK. What do you think was the rationale for more stabilization? So the US changed from a 1 in 12 twist, 1 in 12 inch twist, to like a 1 in 7, and now we see a lot of like 1 in 8, 1 in 9 twist barrels. And the rationale for that was the adoption of the Belgian SS-109 cartridge, or cartridge, yeah. It was 5.56 loaded with a 62 grain semi-armor piercing projectile, had a little hardened steel penetrator in it. This was adopted in the 1970s, and it became the NATO standard 5.56 round. Before that, the US had a 55 grain, just plain lead core, copper jacketed bullet that we used that 55 grain in that particular length of bullet stabilized just fine out of a 1 in 12 barrel and tended to tumble, fragment, do nasty things when it hit, which was great. However, the longer 62 grain bullet wouldn't quite always stabilize in that slow of a barrel twist. And so the M16A2 got a faster twist barrel to properly stabilize not just the 62 grain semi-AP round, but also, I believe it was M856, the tracer version of that round, which was even longer. That was the rationale. Now, a lot of people aren't thrilled with that decision. M855 was adopted to meet a standard of penetrating a ballistic helmet at a given range. It was something stupid, 500 or 600 meters, which is a task that it really doesn't have to do. There were a lot of complaints about this ammunition when the US had military expeditions over in Somalia. You've heard about it. Like, it's most classically referenced in Black Hawk Down, that the green tip, which is M855, which is the American issued version of the Belgian SS-109 cartridge, that stuff wouldn't properly drop people. It wouldn't stop people. You'd have to shoot someone a whole bunch of times with it because it didn't do this tumbling, fragmenting sort of behavior. So yeah, that's the backstory on that. Today, by the way, I shoot almost no M855 because it is semi-armor piercing and it will do nasty, obnoxious things to steel targets at matches as well as to my own steel targets, and I much prefer the 55 grain simple lead core bullets that don't do nearly as much damage to targets. So that's what I shoot. Michael says, does liking a sight matter in how well it works for you? I ask because I have iron sights I love, early foul irons. I dislike early Galil, but on the clock, I'm about the same performance. Same with optics as well. That's an interesting question. I think this is more of a reach out to the audience and ask people sort of question. To me, it's not something I'd really thought about because I use a wide variety of different optics, or different iron sights as well as optics, because I'm always using a wide variety of different guns when I'm out shooting. And I definitely have some sights that I prefer over others, but thinking about it now, I can't say that the ones I dislike are necessarily less accurate. They may be slower in some cases, but to be honest, I've never really done any significant testing like of one type of sight versus another. So that's a really good question. Perhaps share with us your experience on this particular one down in the comments below, and let's see if there's a consensus that you guys have on whether the fact that you like the iron sights actually pairs up with you shooting better with those iron sights. Manuel says, what happened to the Calico's drum magazine reliability series videos? Basically what happened is the gun stopped working right, and I never got around to dealing with it, and so I stopped doing the videos. This was a number of years ago. I thought it would be interesting to just like start loading up Calico drums, a Calico drum, and see when it started malfunctioning, because they have a pretty poor reputation for reliability. That is not nearly as harsh, spicy as people often think of rye. That is more of a warm, rounded fireplace rye bread, rye toast deliciousness. Anyway, the Calico drums have a poor reputation for reliability, and I was thinking a lot of that may be due to people not properly winding it. So if we make sure we do the process right, can we show a Calico drum running for a very long period of time? And it ran, I think we got to the third loading of it before the gun started having problems, and I fixed it sort of once and then brought it back out. In the fourth iteration, the gun continued to have a bunch of problems, and that was just, honestly, I just kind of lost interest in the test at that point, because if the gun's not going to run right, then who cares if the magazine's good or not? Also, the ammo was starting to get expensive at 100 rounds a pop. The goal was like 1,000 rounds of 9mm at the time was pretty pricey. I was doing this mid-pandemic, as I recall. So yeah, basically the gun stopped working. I lost interest and dropped it because I had a lot of other things to do. Verda says, I know I asked you this question years ago, but did you ever get any feedback from Shih after publishing your book, Pistols of the Warlords, considering how old your videos with him were, and are there any plans to coordinate maybe another visit? I don't have any specific plans to coordinate another visit. I did actually ask him to review the book, Pistols of the Warlords. I asked him for help with research on it, and essentially the response that I got back was like, I can't help you find information on those pistols because there is no information on those pistols. Like, there is nothing out there for you to get or to find. If I remember correctly, the implication was like, you can't even do a book on these guns because what are you even going to say about them? From my perspective, just having the several hundred examples that we did have for that book was a fantastic rationale to do the book, to actually catalog them and show what the different variations are, even if there isn't good information available on exactly where and when each different variation was manufactured or for whom. So I haven't really kept up with Bin after that. Just, again, a lot of things going on, and I have, aside from those mystery pistols, very few Chinese, like old school pre-communist Chinese firearms. Very few of those come into my possession. There aren't a lot of them out there in general. The one that we interviewed Bin about in particular was kind of the one really really standout one, which is the General Liu rifle. And it's an old video, but it stands out. It stands up, and I don't know that there's any need to really redo it. Our next question is from TJ, who said, did the Finns get their RK right? Regarding your new book about Finnish small arms, what do you think? Perhaps which of the many RK prototypes deserved more development or adoption by the military? He is talking about the RK-62, the classic Finnish AK, which is, of course, covered in significant detail, it and all of its follow-on developments, in my new book, Forged in Snow, which is available right now down on Kickstarter. I'll have a link in the description text. I think, honestly, they got this thing pretty well right. There have not been a lot of weak points in the RK. Now, they did go to a stamped receiver. The initial design was done with a milled receiver. They eventually dabbled with a stamped receiver, made them for the military for about 5 years before deciding that they didn't really convey much benefit, and they did have some shortcomings in terms of durability, so they abandoned it, went back to milled receivers for the military. There were a couple of early modifications made to address some faults, things like giving a low light option for sights. These later guns they all have night sights on them, even the civilian ones like this, interestingly. They improved the end of the stock, the butt plate, reinforced it to make it stronger. Like, these things just work. The fact that they're still chugging along with, of all things, Finnish conscripts kind of shows you that that's a durable, reliable gun. It's reasonably accurate, as much as an AK is, and as much as it needs to be for the combat environment in Finland, which is typically heavily wooded and rarely offers shots in excess of maybe 200 meters. Like, AK is a pretty darn solid platform to begin with, and the Finns did a really good job of it. As for experiments, I would say early on there was some testing of like simplifying this gun more than it currently is. Things like, maybe we don't even need a trigger guard. They made the right choice on that one by including a trigger guard. They initially, early on, experimented with essentially a folding Carcano bayonet for these things. The standard knife blade bayonet's probably a better idea. No one wants to really run around with a folded bayonet on the end of the rifle, which is really the only benefit of having one of those Carcano M38 bayonets. Yeah. Trying to think, some of the other, those were the two main versions that they experimented with during the troop trials phase of RK adoption. They later on considered a number of other variations, things like moving the sights back up here to the traditional position of AK sights. The Finnish military rejected that idea, decided they wanted to stick to the aperture sights, which I think is, again, the right plan. They experimented with a plastic stock. They experimented with some early folding stocks, all of which were not really up to the level of durability required for Finnish conscript use. And so, yeah, in general, I think they made a series of pretty good decisions on this. Martin says, if you could pick any fully functional tank and a place to play with it, what would you pick? All right, so I've dabbled in a couple of tanks, which has been a really awesome experience. I like small and maneuverable rather than big and chunky and gargantuan. And so the two tanks that come to mind to me, one of them will surprise nobody, I'm sure, and that is the Renault FT17. Essentially, I would say the first modern tank, the first tank to have that truly modern layout with a turret, with, you know, tracks that don't go over the entire vehicle. It's cool and it's really cute. And not that long ago, I had a guy actually send me some video of a reproduction one he made himself running on the drivetrain of a Willys Jeep, basically. And it looked awesome. Like, that'd be really fun. It is also really clunky, really slow, a mechanical nightmare because the design comes from, like, you know, World War I. And it would require a lot of hands-on mechanical work to do. And I don't know that I'm really interested in doing that kind of work, all to have a tank that runs at about 3 miles an hour. Still be super cool. The more modern option that I think would be pretty fun would be one of the German Bundeswehr Weasels. They also have a little tiny dinky two-man, I think it's either two-man or, no, it's a two-man, like a light airborne recon tank that comes armed with either a dual feed 20mm cannon or an anti-tank missile launcher. And those look like a lot of fun, really maneuverable, kind of I don't know if I'd call it a modern iteration of the FT-17, because it really is intended for a different role. It's for scouting and ambush, and not, the FT-17 was kind of a main infantry tank, just a small one, before people really knew how to make tanks and what would work best. But I've actually gotten to see one of those weasels at the military museum in, not Nuremberg, in Dresden. There's a museum in Dresden, has one outside. And that was really cool. Like, I think that would be a lot of fun to zip around in. Brian says, I recently picked up a 5-digit serial number Rock Island Arsenal model 1903 that was Arsenal refurbished in January 1919 and left in Cosmoline ever since. I need to remove the Cosmoline, obviously, to enjoy it. Is this gun more unique, interesting, rare in its current state as a collectible, or are there enough in such a state that I should just clean it up and enjoy it? That's an interesting question. To me, like, I've never really thought that having a gun still in its packing material really conveys that much benefit to it. It's one of those tricky things. Like, we get, there are a lot of, not a lot, but there are French Moss 36s out there that are still in like the paper wrap, not factory wrap, but the refurbished depot reserve paper mummy wrapping. And people try to sell them for a premium because they're still in the wrap. But as long as it's in the wrap, if you have a rifle like this 1903 that's packed full of Cosmoline, you can't really display it. You certainly can't shoot it. And I don't know, to me, it's a little bit interesting to see how the guns were stored, but that's kind of the extent of it. I don't think it conveys a tremendous amount of additional value to have it packed up in such a way that, you know, yeah, it's rare. Once you unpack it, that's gone. You can't repack it, but also you lose out on a lot of other things by leaving it wrapped up. Like, you can't really see it. You can't use it. If it were me, what I would probably be tempted to do is sell that rifle for a bit of a premium to someone who does think it has value still being in its 106-year-old Cosmoline, and buy a different one that is in, 90% condition, so that I'm not concerned, not afraid to go out and shoot it. That's probably what I would do. Let's see. Wayne says, as your research life continues, I assume you're still acquiring books for your reference library. How large is your reference library collection at this point? Yes, I am absolutely still building the library. I make a point to acquire basically every firearms reference book that I find. I'm starting to branch out into more foreign languages. Google Translate can do a really surprisingly good job on a lot of that stuff now. It's not perfect, but it's good enough to get, like, there's some books out there in other languages besides English that are really good reference material for guns that we just don't have much written on in English. So I'm interested in those. I have, by very rough estimation, I went through and counted before I sat down to film this, probably about 1,500 books. That reference library back there is by far the most important thing for forgotten weapons, more important than a gun collection, because that's where all the information comes from. And I really like having a big library. Frankly, books are a lot more compact than guns, and I don't have to worry about them rusting. Landrick says, have you ever gotten to do any shooting with a functional M3 carbine with the night vision? If so, what were your impressions? No, I have not. I've seen a little bit of video. Legacy Collectibles got one that was functioning, or it was mostly functioning, and they rebuilt the battery pack and rewired the electronics to make it work, but I think it was the original tube. And the results are, like, not great. It's really poor. I have toyed with the idea of trying to get an M3 snooper carbine to take to Moons Out and actually use in a match. And aside from them being extremely rare, like, functional ones are extremely, extremely rare, and nobody who has one wants you to take it out and run around shooting with it all night. But they're also just, the performance is so poor compared to today's expectations that, like, to a certain extent, people love to watch struggle and failure in matches, but I think this would be so bad, it would just not be that interesting to even watch. those were guns that required a massive amount of artificial illumination. That's why there's a giant infrared spotlight on top of the already rather large image intensifier tube. And you get 30 or 50 yards, like that's kind of it. You know, it is the sort of thing, like they didn't really go out hunting at night with those guns. They used them as sentry post tools. Like you set up a sentry and he can watch a perimeter using that thing. And it's not so much about being able to actively like shoot an enemy soldier that you see. Obviously that is part of the idea, but it's more about being able to spot the guy and raise an alarm. And man, they're like, it is very green and very fuzzy and low resolution, and it's bad. Like it's very much Gen 0 of that technology. That said, I'd still love to shoot one and film it. I'd love to film one if I ever had the chance to do some video footage of one, to be able to show you guys what that really looks like, as well as experience it myself. I'd love to do it, but the opportunity hasn't come up yet. And by the way, before anyone brings it up, because I know it'll come up, the German one, the Vampir, there are no functioning Vampirs in existence. I think there might be a World War II German tank-mounted infrared system, like one of them that still survives functional somewhere. There are only a couple of original Sturmgewehr-mounted Vampirs around. They pretty much all came out of lakes. There were some reproductions that were done using similar vintage intensifier tubes a number of years ago. They look the same, but they don't really function quite the same. They're still terrible, but like they're not authentically originally terrible. They're just really early night vision that sucks. Even one of those would be kind of interesting, but there will, like, you'll never see footage from an authentic original Vampir here or anywhere else because they just don't exist anymore. I'm sad to say it, but that's the truth. Clean Sweep says, what do you think has been the big progression blocker for polymer-cased ammunition? We've seen various companies over the past decade produce seemingly workable solutions, but for some reason, they never quite get the buy-in required for mass production, despite the obvious weight savings and manufacturing benefits. The problem is ammunition, like a cartridge case, has one specific set of material property requirements. You need, and this is why brass is used, you need a material that will expand under pressure and seal, and then will contract back down to basically its original dimensions when the pressure is relieved, and it will be able to do this without cracking, without failing, essentially, because we want that chamber to seal when you're shooting, but then you have to be able to extract it well. Polymers have a whole different set of material properties, and the benefits of a polymer case are not based on polymer being actually good for use as a cartridge case. They're based on some of the downsides of brass as a cartridge case. As Clean Sweep points out here, polymer-cased ammunition is predominantly lighter than regular ammo, a regular brass case. That's the benefit you get. Really, like that's the only benefit you get from polymer, where you then also you have to deal with pressure issues. Often, in order to deal with the pressure issues, they will put a metallic case head bonded to a polymer case body. You have issues with the bonding, you have issues with the polymer breaking seal, having extraction issues, and you have to overcome all of that, and you end up with a lot of R&D costs and expensive ammo to ameliorate a weight issue that's generally not really that significant. And so the place where we see this actually getting adopted is for things like 50 cal ammo in helicopters, places where the weight restriction really is really important and can justify the added cost and trouble of getting the stuff to work right. When it comes to infantry rifle ammo, yeah, you can save some weight in a soldier's loadout if they have polymer-cased ammo, but it's not a ton of weight, and it's hard-pressed to justify the problems that it brings along with it, you know. If someone came up with a really, like, a material that could compete with brass on the technical specs of being a cartridge case and was also a lot lighter, that would have some appeal. But even like aluminum, it works in some situations and not others, and yeah. So I don't think we'll ever, well, someone might develop a polymer material. Like polymer covers a whole bunch of a huge range of materials. It's like saying polymer versus metal. Metal can be a lot of different things. Metal can be titanium, metal can be zinc, metal can be, you name it. Someone may come up with a polymer at some point that is a pretty good material for a cartridge case, and then perhaps we would see it being used heavily. But until they figure that chemistry out, it ain't gonna happen. Felix says, I wonder if post-war, World War II, submachine gun developments would have been different or a thing at all in Western countries if they'd adopted intermediate cartridges instead of 7.62 NATO. I think that the battle rifle concept kind of dictates having a lighter and more mobile weapon for specialized roles, as it cannot, like the AK, fulfill the role of a standard issue rifle and submachine gun. I think, Felix, you are exactly correct. I think had NATO gone directly to 5.56, there would have been very few submachine guns out there. There still would have been some, because there are non-infantry roles for submachine guns that make sense. The police are a big one of them. Using pistol cartridges in a more potent automatic weapon makes sense. But what we see is that when militaries, like the NATO militaries that adopted 7.62 NATO battle rifles, typically had submachine guns that they would issue to paratroopers, squad leaders, armored vehicle personnel, the guys who didn't want to tote around this giant boat anchor of a FAL or a G3. And when those militaries went to 5.56, all of a sudden, like, the rifles get shorter, they get lighter. The need for a submachine gun really kind of drops away, and most of the submachine guns did in fact disappear with the adoption of 5.56 NATO. All right, next up, we have a question from G.I. Orge, who says, as you've had one of these in your own hand, do you see any development progress or future for guns like electromagnetic pulse rifles with solid bullets? Maybe. So there are two different, very distinct types of electromagnetic firearm. They work really differently, and I think a lot of people mix them up or don't realize that they're different in the first place. You have a Gauss rifle, which acts by using a magnetic field to pull a conductive projectile down a barrel using electromagnetic fields. Those are typically fairly good at launching a large mass at a relatively low speed. You then have railguns, in which the projectile is actually in direct physical contact with a pair of launch rails, and you push it using electromagnetic force. Those are typically very good at launching a very light projectile at very high velocities. And depending on what you're trying to do, they can both have some interesting use cases. There might be a potential for anti-drone use with railguns, because you can get a very high muzzle velocity, which allows you to deal with fast-moving targets. You have a computerized, automated railgun system that's got the potential to be pretty decent on drones, and your projectile is going to have no computerized anything in it. It's just going to be a slug of metal, so the ammunition per shot is extremely cheap, which is really important for drone, counter-drone use, but requires still some technological development and a whole lot of electrical power to run at this point. And frankly, there's probably no way around the whole lot of electrical power. They will only be useful in positions where you can have a whole lot of electrical power. The Gauss rifles, it's harder to see a really good use case for those in modern military affairs. I don't know. I suspect both of these are getting a fair amount of R&D done at the very secretive levels by something like DARPA, and I don't know any of the details about that. I've seen what Arc Flash Labs is doing on the commercial side, and I'm excited by that. It's got a little ways to go before it's actually a weapon more than a cool science fair novelty thing. Not to put them down, like, the product they have is fantastic. It's really impressive what they're doing with it. It's just not at the level of being a militarily viable lethal weapon at this point. But I think there is potential. There's also, of course, potential in directed energy weapons, actual straight up lasers. And I don't know, we'll see which ends up coming out on top. Next up, we have George says, with a lot of European nations going to M16-based designs, do you think we'll be seeing parts kits for SA-80, AK-5, FAMAS, etc. coming anytime soon? I think we will in small numbers, but probably not in large numbers. I feel like the era of national militaries surplusing 300,000 obsolete rifles to whoever will pay the highest bid is kind of gone. There's a lot more political political push to destroy guns instead of selling them to make back the money and let people like Americans have some cool stuff. So I think there will always be some small numbers that sneak out, especially from third-party countries. You know, we may not get FAMAS kits from France. Oh, we are actually getting a very small number of FAMAS kits from France, but more likely, maybe, you know, France gives FAMAS to Cameroon, and then Cameroon replaces them with something else, and Cameroon is able to sell some small quantity to an exporter that brings them into the US. A lot of guns get destroyed these days. A lot of guns are also getting sent to Ukraine. That's a fairly recent development, but things like AK-4s, M14s, a lot of that stuff where it would have been surplus and sold or scrapped is now being sent to Ukraine. So who knows? There's a potential that when the war in Ukraine ends, there will be an absolute gold mine of old, weird military surplus coming out of that country. In fact, I suspect that's what's going to happen. They just have to defeat the Russians first. Ryan says, with the now quite clear separation in rolls and cartridges between belt-fed machine guns and intermediate small arms, M7 spear strangeness aside, is now the time for a new generation of primer-actuated designs to emerge, more wonderful and wacky mechanisms to be developed that don't rely on whiz-bang electronics because they'll make better videos in 10 years. No, there will not be primer-actuated guns. We've had significant separation between rifle, like infantry rifle ammo and support machine gun ammo in many different circumstances. Probably the best example would be the Soviet bloc with all of their 7.62x39 infantry small arms, and then their like company level and higher support weapons in 7.62x54 rimmed. That would have been a great place to replace 54 rimmed with some fancy new primer actuated design that doesn't have to operate, you know, a short stroke gas piston. It didn't happen. It's not going to happen today. The challenges of primer actuated stuff are too steep to overcome without giving any real benefit. Primer actuated was cool when it was a way to get around some patents on the obviously better solutions. It's not viable anymore, which is sad. Modern small arms design don't really lend themselves to a treasure trove of really weird mechanisms like we saw emerging in, boy, saw a lot of weird manual stuff in the 1870s, 1880s, and then a lot of weird semi-auto stuff in the, I call it 1900 through 1930. Cool stuff before people figured out how to optimize the system, but now we do have the optimized system, so until there is a significant technological breakthrough in some fairly fundamental realm, we're not going to see, we're going to see a lot of guns that look kind of the same as the gun that came before, but 0.5% more efficient at it. Let's see. What is more important? This is Matthew, says, what is more important for modern militaries, having a lot of rifles that are good enough or having a small number of rifles that are really good? It seems that Western militaries never buy enough rifles to equip their militaries. In war, rifles are usually lost or destroyed, so surely cheaper rifles would be a better idea than really expensive ones. I think the issue we have here is a conflict between current use and emergency potential use. Actually, Finland, let's go back to this RK62 here. Finland is a pretty good example of this. So the Finns have a significant conscript reserve mobilization force that they can bring to bear if Russia decides to come charging over the border again. But they also have a small professional army that actually is full-time and that deploys for the occasional UN peacekeeping mission. And so Finland needs to have both. They need to have really good rifles for their active duty service where they're getting used every day, but they also don't necessarily want to skimp too much on the guns that will be used to defend the country if there is actually another foreign mass invasion. And what the Finns ended up doing is having a lot of basic generic AKs in storage, both the couple 100,000 RK62s that they manufactured over a couple of decades, as well as Chinese and East German AKs that they bought for next to nothing. But then they also have a modified, improved version for current service use. So that would be the RK95 as well as the RK62 modernized series, the M3 really. that I think is the most practical. Like that's the arrangement that works the best. Is you need a gun that's good enough for the reserves in quantities of a few 100,000, and then you need something that's top of the line for the guys who are actually using them every day. But you can't buy the top of the line stuff and stick it in a depot for 40 years and then surplus it, having never actually used it. It needs to be there in case, but what's the opportunity cost of spending 4 times as much on a really great rifle that never actually gets used? Of course, what's the opportunity cost of, you spent nothing on the reserve rifles and then someone did invade and you lost because you had no good small arms and couldn't equip your military. And so everyone has to kind of balance those two conflicting options. You don't want to be the politician who spends all the money on a fancy rifle to go into storage that doesn't get used. You also don't want to be the politician who gets stuck with total junk when there is an urgent need for it. So countries need both. They need good enough and they need top of the line. Honestly, we kind of see that in the US military as well, largely. We have more troops who are full-time active duty and less of a reserve sort of system, but there's a lot of M16s and M4s still sitting out there in Army Reserve somewhere. But then our smaller scale professional force gets things like M27 IARs, and the Special Forces guys get whatever they want, basically. So we kind of do the same thing here, just I feel like Finland is a really good, clean example of exactly how that plan ought to work. Next up, Stephen says, do you think the M14 gets a lot of hate or bad reputation for no really good reason? Essentially, like, what if the M14 had been developed 10 years earlier and we had GIs going into the Korean War with brand new M14s? Would it still have the reputation that it does today? And the answer is maybe. The problem is the M14 is a weird one, because the guys who actually used them or allegedly used them in Vietnam loved them, or at least today they all say that they loved them. And that's because they got the guns that were good. And we know this because they're the guns that actually got issued. The big problem that the M14 had was manufacturing. They had a really hard time getting the M14 up to the accuracy and reliability standards that were required for a military issue firearm. They had tremendous trouble with this, with almost all of the manufacturers across the board. The GIs in the field who eventually got the guns that made it through acceptance and quality control never saw the bad side of the M14. The M14 was a disaster of a program at a very large-scale logistical sort of level, not so much at a tactical one, although there are a few elements that are obviously outdated and not great. The M14 is actually not that accurate of a rifle. It may be, it feels accurate because it's got really good sights and a good trigger, and it allows a lot of shooters to get a lot of their potential out, but you put a top-notch shooter behind a rifle and the M14 will be a limiting factor on them, which is why virtually nobody shoots an M14 in serious national matches anymore. They all shoot AR variants, because those are more accurate guns. The M14 also needs to be properly bedded in order to shoot really well, and when you take it apart, you tend to ruin that bedding and have to redo it. And you kind of have to take the gun apart to do some of the cleaning for it. So it's not a good precision rifle platform. The full auto, and by the way, even if it had been 10 years earlier, that problem would still exist. That problem exists with the M1 Garand. But guys weren't out there trying to be Sniper of the Year with the M1 Garand. It was a battle rifle. It was expected to do 4, maybe 5 minutes of angle, and that's just fine, because that's what's actually viable in a combat situation. Those are the sorts of shooting opportunities you get, and frankly, that's the shooting skill ability of most of the guys who are running those guns. Same thing is true today, too. The full auto capability on the M14 was also a dumb idea from the beginning. It was mechanically way too crude. The full auto mechanism on the M14, we can see on the T20 that I just did a video on that came out like barely after World War II. They'd already, and it's just this kind of kludged latch on the outside of the gun. The M14 never should have had full auto at all. It doesn't need it. It doesn't benefit from it. It's just a bad idea. And it would have been a bad idea in 1951 or 1946 as much as it was in 1957. So to get back to the question, would the M14 have had the same reputation it has today if it had been 10 years accelerated? And the answer would be, if it was the same manufacturing program accelerated 10 years, then yes. If they hadn't had those manufacturing issues, say like the BM59, then I think it would have had a much better reputation. It would have been seen as a cool upgrade to a World War II gun that was still obsolete when it came out, but cool nonetheless, instead of being a mistake of a program. Ian says, how come most magazines are 30 rounds, like the AR-15 or AK-47 families of rifles? Even the Bren had a 30-round magazine. Is it because springs become unreliable for more than 30 rounds? Is it because magazines become too big to fit onto weapons? Those are both part of it. Magazines, I feel like I harp on this a lot. Magazines are really hard to make reliable. We have extremely strict requirements for magazine reliability, you know? 99% reliability in a 30-round magazine essentially means that if you shoot 3 magazines worth, you will get a malfunction. And today, by most people's standards, that's terrible reliability. We want 10 times that. We want to go through 1,000 rounds. Like if you go through 1,000 rounds and get 1 or 2 malfunctions, that's okay. You know, that's okay. It'd be nice if it were a little better, but we can work with that. But that's like really, really a high standard of reliability for a mechanism that we also expect to cost like $5. We're not willing to pay a lot of money for this, but we expect it to work perfectly every single time with a variety of different brands and potentially different loadings and sizes and shapes of ammunition. These are hard to do right. Now that gets compounded when you try and make it really big. The biggest issue is your spring is going to, like the amount of force that the spring delivers to the round on top of the magazine. Let me go back a step here. The forces involved in a magazine change as the amount of ammunition in the magazine changes. So when this is fully loaded, you've got a lot of friction on that top cartridge. When the bolt tries to push the top round out of the magazine, the whole spring's compressed into this little tiny area down here, and it's pushing really hard, and that top round is hard to get out of the magazine. When you get to the very last round, there's a lot less friction. It's just the follower, and the spring has now extended all the way out to here. It's not putting that much force on the cartridge. As you start to make the magazine longer and longer, if you're using a coil spring like that, this change in effective force between the first round and the last round just gets worse and worse and worse. There have been some experiments with magazines that attempted to use constant force springs, like there are a couple actual commercial mags. I think there's a 1022 mag that did it. Ramline, I think, made one. It's essentially like a coiled up clock spring that's riveted onto the back of the magazine here, and as you push the follower down, the spring unwinds itself, and it does actually produce the same amount of force over the course of its travel, but there are other complications to it. You try and, like, if you look at the viability of longer magazines, they're rare. Like, you get some 40s or 45s, but not a lot. And it's like these spring issues become an issue, become a problem. The strength of the V-lips becomes a problem. You have too much force pushing up on that top round of the magazine. Maybe the bolt has enough power to strip it off the mag, but all of a sudden, your feed lips have to be stronger so that they don't deform over the course of the how many thousand rounds you expect one magazine to last while costing $5 or $10. 30 is really kind of that sweet spot where you can deal with the differential in spring in force applied in the magazine. There is also very much an issue of the magazines being awkwardly long. That's something that's often over-exaggerated by military forces, or at least it was early on. There are a lot of countries that went with a shorter magazine specifically out of concerns, or at least partially out of concerns over troops being able to get nice and flat and low to the ground. And I don't think that turned out to be as much of an issue as people expected it to be early on, but it is an issue. You get a 40 or 50 round magazine, those things are stupidly long. It's not just trying to go prone with the gun, it's also how do you store the magazines? You need mag pouches that are, this long. It gets awkward. So 30 really just is that sweet spot. It's kind of the most ammunition you can get into the magazine before you really cross that tipping point where the engineering challenges are no longer worth the extra ammunition that you get. Michael says, is the hesitation lock from the Remington Model 51 and 53 a true locked breech or more of a delayed blowback? That is a really funky, interesting question. So as I see it, this is a locked breech design. And I think what Pedersen did here is essentially he took the Browning system and flipped it around. So with a Browning tilting barrel, what we expect is the slide starts moving. The slide and the barrel are locked together and they start moving, and then the barrel stops and the slide continues, and that gives it the it's gotten the momentum as those two are moving together. The breech remains locked, and then once the barrel stops, the slide continues and it extracts the cartridge, and it's got enough inertia to open all the way and cycle properly. What Pedersen did here is swap that around. The barrel's fixed, but he has a breech block and a slide that move together. So instead of the breech block being fixed in the slide and the barrel moving with it, the barrel's fixed, the breech block is moving with the slide for that first little bit of travel, then the breech block stops and the slide continues backward. So I'm guilty of this. I've often said you define a recoil-operated firearm, like one of the telltales is that it has a moving barrel. I would say this is a recoil-operated locked breech pistol, but the barrel's fixed and it's the breech block that's recoiling, not the barrel. Pedersen was a really clever gun designer. It's interesting, I think it was John Browning himself, actually, when asked who the best gun designer out there was, he named John Pedersen as that guy. Pedersen was clever. The problems with this pistol, and then they're not huge problems, but the shortcomings of this pistol were on durability. Like, it's a really clever system, but the parts are a little bit too light and too small, and they do tend to break over time, which is sort of its downfall. But I would go on the record as saying that that is a locked breech, recoil-operated firearm of a very clever system that I'm sure there's one or two other weird prototypey sorts of guns out there that use a similar system, but I couldn't name any of them off the top of my head. All right, battery change in the camera. Let us push on. Our next question is from Old Man Winter. He says, while the battle rifle may not be the best choice, the M7 Spear, do you think the 6.8x51 cartridge would do well in a general purpose machine gun or designated marksman's rifle, replacing 7.62 NATO perhaps in those roles? No, I don't think it would at all. And I've said, like, I think the round makes sense in the light machine gun, and to a certain extent it does. The idea of having a more powerful cartridge in your light machine gun is fine. That's sort of the 2 caliber standard. You know, you can either have a cartridge optimized for the infantry rifle or optimized for a supporting machine gun, and then you choose, do you give everyone one or the other? Battle rifle era is we give everyone the machine gun optimized cartridge. The assault rifle era is we give everyone the rifle optimized cartridge. And then you do also, of course, have the option of splitting it. The rifles get a rifle optimized cartridge. The machine guns get a machine gun optimized cartridge. And in exchange, the compromise is all of your guns are better suited to their ammunition, but you now have to supply 2 calibers of ammunition instead of 1. Now the problem with the 6.8 is, in this situation, the idea of that 2 caliber thing and having a more powerful machine gun cartridge is fine, but there is no reason that it needs to be the super high pressure hybrid case 6.8x51. The only reason that case exists, the only reason that cartridge is so high pressure is so that you can get a high velocity out of it in a short barreled rifle so that you can put a suppressor on the rifle and still have a relatively handy overall package. If you can have a 20-inch barrel, which the machine guns can very easily have, then there's no actual benefit to having this hybrid case that presents, like, it'd be one thing if this was a brass case that was just really high velocity. But what you get with the super high pressure is vastly reduced barrel wear, or if they actually have the barrel lengths that they're advertising, they're doing it by having way more expensive and complex metallurgy in the barrels to do it. You have accelerated barrel wear, and the complexities of actually manufacturing the ammo and being able to produce it are significant, when you could just do 30-06 out of a 20-inch barrel and get that sucker going the same velocity if you wanted to. Or you could do a 6mm, 6.5mm, but you could do all of these things with a traditional normal cartridge case without needing this 80,000, 75,000 PSI nightmare of an engineering challenge. So if we're going to have 6.8 by 51, I think it makes more sense in the machine guns at least, but we don't need to have it to get those benefits. ERB2 says, which handgun did the most to solidify the 9mm Luger cartridge's position as the one to beat? The original Luger, the high power, the P38, or the Glock? I think it was none of those things. I think it was the cartridge itself that sold the cartridge. 9 Parabellum is sort of the most compact and powerful of the original 9mm service cartridges. People wanted something more powerful than the 32s that were out there. 9mm does pretty well in submachine guns. It's a slightly tapered case. It doesn't have a rim. It's relatively short. It's fairly powerful in a way that benefits submachine guns. I think instead of looking at the pistols that use 9mm to understand why 9 Parabellum was adopted, it's more valuable to look at the other cartridges that it was competing against. So we have 9mm Largo and 9mm Steyr. These are 9 by 23mm cases. They're slightly less powerful than Parabellum while also being physically larger. There's no real good reason to do that. 9 by 20 Browning was a thing. It's semi-rimmed like 32 ACP. That was a problem. Browning did that because early on when he developed that cartridge, head spacing was tricky. The machining tolerances to head space off the case mouth were tricky. And having a small extended rim that you could use for head spacing was a really good solution. Like that was really easy, no problem at all to headspace guns in 9 by 20 or in 32 ACP. But as machining technology got better, that became less relevant, and now you're stuck with this semi-rimmed case it's not impossible to do in magazines, obviously, lots of people did it, but it's definitely trickier. It is not as conducive to easy and reliable magazines. So that one's out. Other cartridges at the time. You had a couple of bottlenecked cartridges, the 30 caliber Mauser, the 30 caliber Luger. People wanted a little more bullet weight typically than those offered. And so 9 Parabellum kind of became this sweet spot of it's got enough bullet weight and enough velocity to do all the really good work, and it's the smallest cartridge around that does get those ballistics, and that's why it became the most popular. Not so much, like, in fact, it's funny, if we look at the pistols that you mention here, they were all available in other calibers. The Luger was actually originally developed in 7.65 Parabellum, and the British and the Americans wanted a bigger cartridge, and that's what prompted development of the 9mm Parabellum. The high power was offered in 7.65 Parabellum as well, and then later in some other cartridges. The P38 was also originally actually available in 7.65 Parabellum if you wanted it. Will says, do you think that the increase in shotgun use as a last-ditch counter-UAS weapon will put any new shotguns on the market, such as the top-loading designs that you didn't think had a market driver before? I really don't. I don't think we're going to see much shotgun development specifically to feed the anti-drone requirements. I think we'll see ammunition development, but like we've pretty well optimized shotguns for rapid reloading in the civilian competition market, for shooting at moving targets in bird hunting and the bird type games. And I don't think I don't think shooting at drones is so much different from any of the other existing shotgun use cases that would benefit redesigning the guns. The ammo, yes, definitely the ammo, but not the guns themselves. ACC says, the fully tactical silenced pistols often have an option to lock the slide closed to prevent the sound of the slide racking and to prevent case ejection. Obviously, this is a major problem if follow-up shots are needed and you have to manually rack the slide in a hurry. Has anyone ever tried to solve both problems by attaching a silencer to a gas seal revolver like the Nagant? The revolver action is already quieter than a semi-auto slide. You would still get double action follow-up shots and not have to police your brass. Yes, actually, and I just recently filmed one of these, and I'll have the video coming at some point, although I don't know when yet exactly. Knight's Armament made a suppressed case-sealed revolver based on a Ruger Red Hawk that they call the R-squared, or the revolving rifle, for exactly that sort of purpose, in order to be silent and not leave brass behind, but still allow repeat follow-up shots. The thing was like totally an assassination tool, and it's hard to justify it as anything else. But they did make it on request from various sneaky squirrel agencies, and I have a video on it. Nobody else has done it because that is such, well, probably, it might have happened somewhere else that we just don't really hear about. In fact, the US did develop essentially an integrally silenced .44 Magnum case that we used in revolvers in Vietnam, but this is such a specialized use case that it's really hard to justify serious firearms development to meet it. You know, normally, if you've got a suppressed, if you're so concerned about the suppression and the covertness that you're putting a slide lock on the gun, the chances of needing a follow-up shot are pretty slim, and it's kind of your fault if you're incompetent enough that you end up needing one and can't deal with it. Philip says, with Moons Out 2026 next year, what are some skill sets someone looking to shoot the match should work on, especially someone who has shot plenty of daytime matches, but shooting under nods is still fairly novel? If you're not familiar, Moons Out is our annual night rifle match. It's rifle only, no pistols, and it is no white light allowed. So night vision goggles, it is active IR, passive IR, or this year I think we've actually cracked the hurdle of having thermally active targets. So we do specifically have a thermal division this year. The match opens for registration on December 1st. I'll have a video announcing it at that point. But if you're looking to come join us and compete and have an awesome time shooting at night, I would strongly suggest essentially get out and walk around at night with your nods. If you haven't done much of that, that's the first most important thing you can do, is get comfortable using night vision goggles. Don't worry about the gun. Just get out there and learn how to navigate and maneuver and what the world looks like under night vision and how to effectively move around in it. Then I think the next most useful thing you can do is dry fire. Actually, it's dry fire in the dark under nods. And so you don't have to go find a shooting range that will allow you to shoot in the dark. You can do this in your house, turn off the lights, put on your nods, get your whatever system you have for the gun. Please be careful and make sure it's unloaded. Like, it's hard to see cartridges in the dark, so double or triple check. But then get some practice if you're shooting passive. Get practice getting your sight picture through your nods, through your optic. If you're shooting active, get a feel for how do we hold and stabilize the gun with an infrared active laser while using nods to shoot with, because it's not the same thing as bringing the gun up to your shoulder and shooting necessarily. So dry fire and just moving around in the world at night with nods on. Those are the two things I would recommend. Mark says, I think it's clear that the Browning tilting barrel action has come to dominate the pistol space, particularly for military and police users. My impression is that this has been driven by Glock having an 80% good enough pistol at very affordable cost versus, say, HKP7s, a pistol in theory mechanically superior, but at a much more expensive price point. Given this, how much room do you think there is for the latest round of exotics, high-priced pistols with lever or gas delay systems that actually move the space forward in terms of broad acceptance of a better operating system that will face widespread adoption in the handgun space? I think there is absolutely space for these exotic pistols. Things like the Alien, things like the Rideout Dragon, they will sell. They're not gonna, you're not gonna sell 100,000 of them to the NYPD, but you will sell them in small numbers at high prices to enthusiasts, because there are a lot of people who don't need the gun to just be generic, good enough, it's a tool, I don't even know how it works, I don't know what the model is, I just know that, pull trigger, bullet comes out, and I leave it in the holster because I don't really ever actually have to shoot anybody. That's the market for Glock. It will, guaranteed, probably, realistically, it'll work. When you just pull it out of the holster for the first time in a year and pull the trigger, it'll fire. That's what the police need. Enthusiasts want something better and will relish the technological capacity, the capabilities, the novelty, and the coolness of some of these new pistols. And I have to admit that that applies to me too. I think in terms of technology in general, we can look at this as similar to watches. There are guys who will go spend $50,000 on a super duper hyped watch that doesn't do anything different than a $20 Casio, but it's cool, and there is a market for those. There's a significant market for those. There's a lot of watch companies out there selling watches that are way more expensive than you actually need, which is not to say you shouldn't get one if that's what you like. Like, I'm not going to go out and tell everyone you should sell all of your pistols and just have a single police trade-in 40 caliber Glock. No, get what you like, get what you enjoy. But if you only need it for the absolute rawest mechanical functionality, a police trade-in Glock's going to do you just fine. In historical context, I think the interesting comparison here is the flintlock era, where for a very long time, we sort of had this plateau in firearms development at the muzzle-loading flintlock. You know, it's slow to shoot, it's not particularly accurate, most of them are smoothbore guns. That was the military standard. And yet, at that same time, the aristocracy, the fancy engraved guns that survive from that period, are not flintlock muzzle loaders, they are wheel locks. Some muzzle loaders, but there are like breech-loading wheel locks from that same time period that were ridiculously more expensive to manufacture, and they were not the standard military firearm, but there was still very much a market for the higher-end consumer who wanted and appreciated a fancier, nicer gun. And does it do the same thing? It throws a lead ball down range, but a wheel lock is nicer. It's cooler. It's, to my mind, wheel locks in the 1700s, 1600s are very analogous to Laugo aliens and their like today, compared to, well, the other end being the Glock and the generic flintlock single-shot musket. So yeah, there's absolutely a space for them. And there's a possibility that some of the developments from that high-end market will trickle down into standard generic pistols, but there's also the possibility that they won't. Like, the wheel lock never became a standard issue thing, a standard system. They were expensive, they were sort of a separate class of firearm, and that was fine. Eventually, percussion guns replaced both of them. Ya says, will the books you write or promote be available in Europe from a European reseller? Yes and no. So we have a separate webpage actually specifically for European orders. It is headstampbook.com. What we do when we print a new book is we have the printer ship a small batch of them directly to a warehouse that we maintain through a friend in France, and we sell books within the EU out of France until that batch runs out. Once those books run out for a particular title, it is not economically feasible to restock the European warehouse until or unless we do another print run, at which point we'll restock the European warehouse. So we do always offer books from a European shipment perspective so that it's a lot less expensive to ship than going from the US into Europe, but for a relatively limited time. Now, in the case of Forged in Snow, the new book I'm doing on Finnish small arms, that one is actually going to be fulfilled by Varusteleka in Europe. So we'll have a batch of books at Varusteleka, and you'll be able to buy it in Europe from them. But other than that, it's basically the same deal. It just made sense to do it in Finland because it's a Finnish book and they're really excited about it, and I'm excited about it, and I like Varusteleka and working with them. Let's see, we have two more questions here. Randy says, settle a debate for my friend and I have had for quite some time. In your opinion, who is more influential to machine gun development, Hiram Maxim or John Moses Browning? I'm going to go with John Moses Browning. Browning had more machine gun developments than Maxim did. Maxim came first, but Maxim's design was not super elegant. Like, Maxim was a clever engineer and entrepreneur and inventor, and he was the first one to make a machine gun work, but he was not the firearms designer that Browning was. Browning was a true, probably the most substantial ever genius of firearms design. Browning's machine guns are substantially better than Maxim's in terms of manufacturability, in terms of reliability, use. Like, Maxim made it work. John Browning made it look easy. So I'm going to go with Browning on that, even though he wasn't the first one. Rusty, last question here, says, in Western movies, we rarely see characters actually procuring cartridge ammunition. What was the supply chain like in Western or frontier times? What were the odds of finding your specific cartridge at a fort, trading post, general store, given the variety of rounds that were in use? Was cartridge reloading a common practice? Could you typically place orders if unavailable? I am not an expert in this sort of logistical trail, but there are a couple of things that I can point out. One is that cartridges tended to be a little bit more multi-purpose than they are today. There were a fair number of situations where you could make a cartridge work in a gun that wasn't specifically made for it. 32 longs and 32 shorts, like they're head spacing off the rim of the case, which is generally going to be the same, which means that you can successfully head space the case in an overly long chamber. As long as the bullet diameter's roughly the same, it'll work. These are black powder cartridges, so your pressures are a bit less. You have higher safety well, you don't necessarily have higher material safety margins, but you've got a lot less pressure that you're dealing with in the guns. For large parts of what we think of as the traditional Old West, they weren't using cartridge revolvers. They were using black powder muzzleloading revolvers, and those muzzleloaders continued in use in the more rural frontier areas for a while after the development of cartridges, specifically because of this ammunition issue. If you have a muzzleloader, you can have a bullet mold, and all you have to do is procure gunpowder and percussion caps and lead, and you can make ammunition. And that was, I think, the most viable solution for most of these guys. If you're going out beyond the reach of the modern logistics train in 1860, 1870, then you take a muzzleloading gun that you can make ammunition for yourself, and that's how you solve the issue. There was cartridge reloading done. There absolutely was. How commonplace it was is unclear. I know Native American tribes did reload ammunition as a way to supply guns that they acquired from the US cavalry. You know, 50, 70s, 45, 70s, they were reloading that ammunition, not necessarily always with like proper modern tooling, but they made it happen because that was the only way they could use those guns. But that's why you see a lot of muzzleloaders in use longer than you would think would make sense, is because how do you get the ammunition for them when you're 500 miles past the edge of civilization, past the edge of where the train will take your ammunition manufactured in Connecticut? So it's not the greatest answer. I apologize. You've asked that question several times, and I figured I owed it to you to give you the best answer that I could. I'll see if I can look into that a little more and maybe find a better subject matter expert who can give us a more in-depth analysis of that question. Anyway, until then, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Big thanks to Kiro for sponsoring today's Q&A and providing me with a delicious bottle of rye whiskey. Once again, if you're interested in trying this out, this is remarkably affordable and fantastically high quality whiskey, as well as gin. I have a link to their website down in the description text below. If you are in the US or the UK or Germany, you can order it directly online, have it delivered. You can use the code ForgottenRye10 and get 10% off your order. So give it a try. Thanks for watching.